Park Young-soo died on Wednesday at 2:47 p.m. in the basement of a shopping mall on the outskirts of Seoul. He knew the exact time because he had looked at his watch 3 seconds before the blow. Kang Joo-hyun was standing 2 meters away from him, holding a ventilation pipe in his hand. Park had known Joo-hyun for 7 years and called him the only person he trusted more than himself. Soo-young stood by the stairs and didn't look at Park because she couldn't bear to look at him. She had called him that morning and asked him to come here at exactly this time. Park came without asking questions because her voice sounded frightened and he had loved her for 3 years. Joo-hyun told him that the debt was settled and the offer from Chae Sung-jin's people had been accepted. Park didn't understand right away because the words were ordinary, but the meaning behind them was alien and cold. Chae Sung-jin was the man to whom Park owed 120,000 won 4 months ago. Joo-hyun had made a deal with Choi earlier, and the deal simply amounted to the disappearance of one man. The pipe came down on Park's left temple, and he fell face down onto the concrete without a sound. The pain was sharp and deep, like a nail driven straight through the bone into the darkness beyond. He heard Eunji crying quietly somewhere behind him, and Joo-hyun's footsteps near his head. The second blow came from above, and after it, everything became quiet and still and very cold. The darkness turned out not to be empty. Park saw the sky above a city he didn't recognize because there wasn't a single light in it. Seoul lay under 3 meters of snow, and the snow was still falling vertically without a breeze. Towers jutted out of the snowdrifts like broken teeth, and there was no light in a single window. The air temperature on the screen, which wasn't there but which he could see, was -58. He saw Tokyo under the ice, and Shanghai under the ice, and the road from Busan that was no longer there. He saw children in an underground bunker eating something from tin cans and remaining silent. He saw a date written in marker on the wall of that bunker, and the date was March 2027. He saw an empty highway where a sign pointing toward Incheon stood, and the sign was half buried in the snow. Then everything vanished. Park opened his eyes and saw a gray concrete ceiling with a diagonal crack running through the middle. He was lying on his back on the hard floor, and there was no blood at the back of his head, though there should have been. His left temple didn't hurt, and that was the first thing he checked with his fingers before moving. His skin was intact, and his mind was working clearly, without any noise or darkness behind his eyes. He sat up and surveyed the room methodically from left to right, as he always did in unfamiliar places. A basement, another basement, a concrete floor, a metal door, and a single light fixture on the ceiling. There was no lock on the outside of the door because it opened inward, and the latch was on his side. On the floor next to him lay a gray backpack with no markings and 3 compartments. He opened the backpack, and inside were the following items: a knife, a flashlight, 3 energy bars, and a phone. The phone displayed the date, which was September 14th, 2026, and the time was 6:12 a.m. Park sat motionless for exactly 1 minute, mentally listing what he knew to be hard facts. Fact 1. 6 months is roughly 180 days until March 2027, according to his calculations. Fact number 2. He had seen the end, and the end was real because people don't make up things like that when they're dying. Fact number 3. He had no money, no allies, and not a single person he trusted. He knew the last one best of all because 2 of the people he trusted had just killed him. He smiled quietly in the empty basement because the anger was already inside him and wasn't going anywhere. He stood up and checked his pockets, and in his right pocket he found a folded piece of paper with an address in Incheon. The address was handwritten, and the handwriting wasn't his. There was nothing else on the paper. He put the paper in his backpack, took a knife, and slipped it into the left pocket of his jacket, the handle facing him. He walked to the door and opened it. Beyond the door was a staircase leading upstairs, and a faint gray light from above. Park Young-soo climbed the stairs on his second morning with a single thought he didn't voice aloud. He was thinking about the bunker. Only about it. About its depth and volume, and how many people it would take to build it. The address led to an industrial area near the western port, where the air smelled of salt and rusty iron. Park got there on foot in 2 hours and 40 minutes because there wasn't a single vehicle in sight. He walked along the highway, counting cars and counting poles, keeping a knife in his left pocket with the handle facing him. The area was called Sodo, and on his phone's map it looked like a gray grid of warehouses and docks. The building he was looking for was the one at the end of the row, and there was nothing on the facade except the number 71 painted in white. The door was steel and new, and it didn't match the old concrete around it at all. Park stopped 5 meters away and looked at the door just long enough to make up his mind. He made up his mind, walked over, and knocked 3 times with his knuckles, without pausing between the knocks. The silence lasted 12 seconds, and then the door swung inward, revealing an old man standing in the doorway. The old man was short and gaunt, and he looked at Park without asking a question, as if he already knew the answer. Im Hak-jun. That was the name he gave when Park crossed the threshold and the door closed behind him. Inside, the warehouse was divided into 3 zones, and Park assessed them in 4 seconds as he walked forward. The first zone was the living area, a folding bed, a table, and a small refrigerator against the left wall. The second zone was the work area, blueprints on boards, a laptop, and stacks of folders along the right wall. The third zone was empty, and it was the largest part of the warehouse. Park immediately understood what it was for. He sat down at the table, folded his hands in front of him, and looked at Park like a man who was short on time. He said he knew who Park was, knew what he had seen, and knew that his return was no accident. Park listened without responding, waiting for the moment when the old man would say something that could be verified. He said that in March 2027, the average temperature in Korea would drop to -61 degrees. He told him he had data and calculations and that he had been working on this alone for 8 months. He told him that the note with the address had been written by him and left where Park was supposed to wake up. Park smiled quietly because the old man had just explained too much in too short a time. A person who really knows something dangerous doesn't blurt it out to a stranger within the first 3 minutes. But the phone cards worked, and the address was real, and the door was steel and new, and that cost money. Park asked, testing the waters. He wanted to know exactly what Im Hak-jun would get out of this partnership. The old man didn't hesitate. He said he needed hands, he needed a head, and he needed a man without attachments. Park scanned the blueprints on the boards, stepped right up close to them, and looked at them for exactly as long as necessary. The blueprints were genuine. Soil cross-sections, ventilation diagrams, calculations for load-bearing walls under snow pressure. On one sheet was a table with figures. Depth, 12 meters. Volume, 840 cubic meters. Construction time, 22 weeks. 22 weeks is 154 days, and Park had 180, so the difference was small. He stood in front of the blueprints and calculated in his head without showing anything on the outside, and on the outside, he remained calm. Then he turned to the old man and said he needed money, documents, and a place to stay for the night. Im Hak-jun opened a desk drawer and placed an envelope, a plastic card, and a key in front of Park. The envelope contained 300,000 won in cash. It wasn't a gesture of trust, but a down payment for the job. Park took the envelope, took the card, took the key, and put everything in his backpack without a word and without thanks. Im watched him, and in the old man's eyes there was neither warmth nor coldness, only calculation and weariness. Park said he had one question, and it was a simple one. How many people would ultimately fit into this bunker? The old man gave a number, 12. Park nodded and sat down in a chair at the desk, opened the top folder, and began reading from the first page. Im Hak-jun didn't interrupt him or add a word, and that was the first thing Park liked about this man. Outside the warehouse window, the sun was setting, and in the Sodo Industrial District, there wasn't a single extraneous sound. Park read and memorized, and he already knew that the question wasn't whether to build it or not, but who would go inside. 11 spots remained after him, and he wasn't going to give any of them to a random person. Park didn't sleep that night because Im Hak-jun's files contained 847 pages, and he read them all. The data had been collected over 8 months, and the sources were varied: universities, military archives, and satellite images. The picture was coming together into a single reality, and that reality was as simple and irreversible as a blow to the temple with a pipe. The polar vortex would shift in February 2027, and the shift would be permanent, not seasonal. Temperatures in Korea would plummet from 0 to minus 58 degrees in 9 days, and then continue to fall. Infrastructure would collapse on the third day because pipes, wires, and roads weren't designed for this. Im Hak-jun calculated that only those who went underground deeper than 8 meters before the drop began would survive. Park closed the last folder at 5:40 a.m. and sat in the silence of the warehouse, staring at a single spot on the wall. He wasn't thinking about the cold or death, but about the soil, because soil is where everything begins. Im Hak-jun was sleeping on a cot 3 meters away from him, breathing evenly, and Park didn't wake him. At 6:15 a.m., Park left the warehouse with his phone, a knife, and an envelope, and headed toward the port. He needed someone who knew the soil in this area, not from books, but from experience. In the port area, such people show up early because shifts on the dock start at 7 in the morning. Park found the right person at a coffee vending machine at the entrance to Pier 3 at 6:48 a.m. Jong Byung-gi was a foreman for earthwork, and you could tell that by his hands and the way he stood. Park approached and said he was looking for someone who understood the bearing capacity of the soil in Sodo. Jong looked at him without interest and asked through the silence, "Why would a young guy need this so early in the morning?" Park said he was a builder, that he paid in cash, and that he had no questions about the source of the money. Jong Byung-gi took a sip of coffee and stared at Park for another 4 seconds before naming his fee for the consultation. 50,000 won an hour! It was an outrageous price, and Park knew it was a test of his seriousness. He counted out 50,000 from the envelope and placed the bills on the concrete parapet between them. Jung took the money and became a different person, composed and to the point, with no unnecessary pauses between words. The soil in Sodo was heterogeneous, and this was a problem Park had already spotted in Eames' blueprints, but kept quiet about. The top 4 meters consist of fill dirt and construction debris, and it cannot bear any load at all. Below that is clay mixed with sand, and while it holds, it requires a pile foundation along the entire perimeter. At a depth of 10 meters, bedrock begins, and that's what holds everything, and will hold it forever. Park listened and calculated in his head. Piles along the perimeter meant an extra 3 weeks and at least 800,000 won. Jung Byung-gi spoke for another 20 minutes, and every word was worth its weight in gold, and every word was necessary. Park asked one additional question. Where in Sodo were there already buildings with foundations deeper than 8 meters? Jung named 2 addresses: the old cold storage warehouse at dock number 7 and the former pumping station by the canal. Park thanked him with a nod and walked back to warehouse number 71 with new knowledge in his head. Im Hak-jun was no longer asleep. He was standing by the drawing boards, looking at Park as he entered. Park walked over to the foundation drawing, pointed his finger at the foundation line, and said one word: piles. Im looked at the drawing and then looked at Park, and something resembling respect appeared in his gaze. The old man said he knew about the soil, but had laid a slab foundation because piles were more expensive. Park said that a slab foundation on fill soil was a coffin, not a bunker, and the difference between them was fundamental. Im Hak-jun was silent for 10 seconds, then picked up a pencil and began making corrections to the drawing without objection. Park watched the old man work and saw that his hands were steady and his mind was clear. He decided that Im Hak-jun would enter the bunker and take one of the 12 spots, and that decision was final. 11 spots remained, and each one had to be earned in his own eyes, not in anyone else's. Outside the warehouse window, a typical day was beginning in industrial Incheon, and no one around him knew that he had 177 days. 300,000 won was nothing, and Park knew that from the moment he took the envelope in his hands. The piles around the perimeter cost at least 800,000 won, and that was just one of 40 items in the estimate. Im Hak-jun showed him the total project budget on the second day, and the figure was 47 million won. Park stared at that number for a long time, emotionless, because panic is a waste of time, not a solution. 47 million over 177 days is 265,000 won per day. He had 250,000 won in his pocket after paying for Jung Byung-gi's consultation yesterday morning. Im said he had 4 million won in personal savings, and that was all the old man had left. 4,300,000 against 47 million. The shortfall was obvious even without a calculator. Park sat at his desk, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the money as a problem to solve rather than a problem to be feared. The problem had a solution, and the solution was to find people who also needed a bunker and who had money. He took a blank sheet of paper and wrote down 3 categories: resources, skills, and a spot inside. Everyone who entered the bunker had to bring one of the 3, and preferably all 3 at once. Money is a resource, and people who know how to make money in unstable conditions have it. Park thought about who he knew before the betrayal, and the list was short, because he had always kept a tight circle. Lee Sang-hoon. Park recalled this name not with warmth, but with cold calculation, because warmth didn't work here. Lee Sang-hoon was a financial analyst who worked at a private fund and knew how to move money discreetly. They hadn't seen each other in 2 years and had parted ways without conflict, which meant the door wasn't formally closed. Park found his number in his phone, stared at it for 3 seconds, and then put the phone back in his pocket. Calling without preparation is a mistake because the first word sets the entire subsequent tone forever. He spent 2 hours formulating a proposal that didn't sound like a plea for help. The proposal went like this. There is a project with a guaranteed return within a 6-month time frame. It was true because survival is the maximum return of all possible options. Park called Lee Sang-hoon at 11:30, and he answered on the second ring, which meant the phone was in his hand. Lee Sang-hoon said he was glad to hear from him, and his voice was even and professional, without any unnecessary warmth. Park laid out the proposal in 90 seconds, without preamble and without any personal explanations. An investment in a closed-type infrastructure project in Incheon with full payback by March 2027. Lee Sang-hoon was silent for 5 seconds, and then asked about the investment amount, and it was the right question. Park named the figure, 20 million won and 1 spot inside the facility for the investor personally. Lee Sang-hoon was silent again, but the silence was different. It contained not caution, but interest. He said he wanted to see the documentation and meet in person, and Park said that would be possible tomorrow. They agreed on 10 in the morning, and Park ended the call first, without any farewells or warmth. Im Hak-jun listened to the conversation in silence, and when Park put the phone down, the old man asked a single question. He asked what would happen if this man came to look, understood everything, and refused to invest. Park looked at the old man and smiled quietly, because the question was valid, but the answer was simple. Anyone who comes to look at the bunker is already halfway in, because curiosity is the beginning of agreement. Lee Sang-hoon was an analyst, and analysts don't attend meetings that make no sense within their system. Park took the blueprints and folders and began preparing a presentation for tomorrow's meeting, without any frills. Numbers, timelines, depth, volume. A temperature forecast for March 2027 with no source but accurate to the degree. Im Hak-jun watched Park work and remained silent again, and once more, that was the right decision on his part. At 11:40 p.m., Park finished and lay down on the floor by the desk because there was only one folding bed and it was taken. He closed his eyes and thought about Kang Joo-hyun and So Eun-ji for exactly 1 second, then pushed them out of his mind. They didn't exist in his calculations. Only the bunker. Only 176 days. Only 20 million tomorrow. Lee Sang-hoon arrived 9 minutes early, and that told Park everything he needed to know about the level of interest. Park opened the door and looked at him for 3 seconds before stepping aside to let him in. Lee Sang-hoon was wearing a gray business suit, which was the wrong choice of attire for a warehouse at the port. He surveyed the room quickly and professionally, and Park saw his gaze linger on the blueprints on the boards. Im Hak-jun stood at the workbench and nodded to the guest without a word, and Lee Sang-hoon nodded back without a word. Park didn't offer coffee or invite him to sit down, because this wasn't a courtesy meeting, but a business meeting. He walked over to the boards and began speaking, talking for exactly 12 minutes without stopping and without taking any questions. Temperature collapse, timelines, depth of bedrock, pile foundation, chamber volume, triple filter ventilation system, standalone generator capable of 800 hours of continuous operation, 18 months worth of food supplies for 12 people, based on a standard of 2,100 kilocalories. Lee San-hong listened without interrupting. His face was impassive, but his hands gave him away from the very first minute. He held the folder he had brought with him, and his fingers moved over it, a sign that his mind was working quickly. When Park finished, the room fell silent, and the silence lasted 7 seconds. Park did not fill it with anything. Lee Sang-hoon asked about the source of the temperature forecast, and it was the only risky question of the meeting. Park looked at him calmly and said that the source was proprietary, and verification through open data was impossible. He added that the analyst had a choice, to verify the source or to verify the math, and the math was open. Lee Sang-hoon paused, opened his folder, took out a printout, and placed it face down on the table. Park did not look at the printout, because looking at it before being invited to do so would be a misstep. Lee Sang-hoon said he had conducted his own analysis after yesterday's call and had worked on it all night. He said that the climate anomalies of the past 8 months fit a specific model. He said that his model puts the probability of a critical temperature event at 34%. Park smiled quietly to himself and showed nothing on the outside, because 34% was a gift. A man who had independently arrived at 34% in a single night would not leave this meeting without a deal. He told Lee Sang-hoon that his model was incomplete because it lacked military monitoring data. He took a single sheet from Ima's folder and placed it next to Lee Sang-hoon's printout, face up. Military satellite monitoring of the Arctic vortex over the past 6 months, with coordinates and dates. Lee Sang-hoon looked at the sheet and remained silent. His fingers stopped on the folder, which meant the calculation was complete. He looked up at Park and asked how many spots were left in the bunker at the moment besides his own. Park said 10, and that was the truth. And the truth worked better than pressure in this particular situation. Lee Sang-hoon nodded and asked about the terms for backing out of the deal if the event did not occur within the specified time frame. Park said there were no exit terms because the money was going into concrete, and concrete doesn't flow back. He added that if the event didn't happen, Lee Sang-hoon would receive a concrete basement in Incheon as his personal property. Lee Sang-hoon looked at him, and something resembling respect for his straightforwardness appeared in his gaze. He opened the folder, took out a document, and placed it on the table. It was the contract he had drafted himself that night. Park took the document and read it for 4 minutes, making corrections in pencil in 3 places without explanation. First Amendment. The deadline for transferring funds is 48 hours, not 7 days, because time is more valuable than comfort. Second Amendment. The space in the bunker shall not be transferred to third parties under any circumstances without his personal consent. Third Amendment. Lee Sang-hoon participates in physical labor on an equal footing with everyone else starting from the first day at the facility. Lee Sang-hoon read the amendments, looked up, and asked about the Third Amendment because it was unexpected. Park said that there were no passengers in the bunker and that everyone inside had to be able to do something with their hands. Lee Sang-hoon was silent for 8 seconds, then picked up a pen, signed the document, and handed it to Park. Park signed it and handed a copy to Im Hak-jun for safekeeping, and the first deal was closed at 10:51 a.m. 20 million won would be deposited into the account in 48 hours, reducing the deficit to 23 million. Lee Sang-hoon was leaving when he stopped at the door and said he had 2 more acquaintances who might be of interest. Park looked at him and said he would send the terms and that he personally makes the decision regarding each person. The door closed and Im Hak-jun looked at Park and remained silent. In that silence, there was no question, only a fact. Park took a pencil and crossed out the line marked financing on his list and wrote the next one next to it. Construction crew. People who know how to work with their hands and who can be bought with silence and a place inside. Jung Byung-gi showed up at the warehouse at 7 a.m. without a call or warning and knocked on the door 4 times. Park opened the door and looked at the foreman, and the foreman looked at him, and Jung spoke first. He said he'd been thinking about their conversation by the coffee machine and that he had questions about the nature of the project. Park stepped aside and let him in because a man who comes on his own is already halfway agreed. Jung Byung-gi walked in, saw the blueprints, stopped by the boards, and stared at them in silence for 2 minutes without saying a word. He was a different person in front of the blueprints, focused and quiet, without the roughness of a dock worker he displayed outside. Then he turned to Park and said that the pile foundation was correct and that the depth had been chosen precisely. He said that on this soil, he himself would have laid the foundation exactly this way and at exactly this depth, not a single meter less. Park listened and waited because Jung Byung-gi had not come for confirmation of his expertise, but for something else. The foreman sat down in a chair without being invited, placed his hands on the table, and looked at Park directly and without mincing words. He said he had been working on the docks for 18 years, and that last winter had been the strangest in all that time. He said that in January the temperature had dropped to -23, a record for 40 years of observations. He said his younger brother was a meteorologist, and that his brother had called him in February and said strange things about a vortex. Park smiled quietly to himself, because people who come on their own always bring with them a reason to trust. He walked over to the table, opened a folder, and placed the temperature forecast for March 2027 in front of Jung Byung-gi. The foreman read in silence, his expression slowly shifting from professional interest to something darker. He looked up and asked how many people knew about this site at the moment, including himself. Park said, 4. Jung Byung-gi nodded, looked back at the blueprint, and asked how many people would be needed to complete the work on time. Park said they needed a crew of at least 6 people, and that the deadline was 175 days. The foreman was calculating in his head, and Park could tell by the way his jaw muscles moved and how his hands froze on the table. Jung said he had 5 men and that all 5 knew how to work and how to keep quiet, a rare combination. Park asked about the terms, and the foreman named the figure, 800,000 won each for the entire duration of the work. 4 million won for 5 people was cheap, and the low price meant that money wasn't the main point of this offer. Park stated this directly. He wanted to know exactly what Jung Byung-gi wanted besides money for the crew's silence. The foreman looked at him, and there was no resentment in his gaze, only respect for the direct, unvarnished question. He said he wanted 2 spots, one for himself, one for his meteorologist brother from Busan. Park looked at him and silently calculated. The crew would handle the physical aspect, and the meteorologist brother would handle the data. A meteorologist with active access to vortex data isn't just a passenger. He's an asset worth several million won. He said he agreed to the 2 spots on one condition. His brother must arrive in Incheon within 7 days. Jung Byung-gi nodded, took out his phone, and called his brother right in front of Park, speaking in a low voice for 3 minutes. He put the phone away and said that his brother would arrive in 4 days, that his name was John Min-jae, and that he agreed. Park took a blank sheet of paper and wrote out the terms by hand in duplicate, and they both signed without a lawyer or a notary. The team will arrive at the site in 48 hours. Payment in 3 installments. Absolute silence. No exceptions. Jung Byung-gi stood up and shook Park's hand. The handshake was brief and firm, with no words spoken afterward. He left, and Im Hak-jun looked at Park from behind the drawing boards, his gaze once again filled with nothing but calculation. The old man said that 8 people now knew about the project, and every new person was a new risk of a leak. Park said that every new person was also a new layer standing between the project and those who wanted to stop it. Im fell silent, turned back to the blueprints, and began making corrections to the ventilation diagram to accommodate the new team composition. Park sat down at the table, opened the list, checked the box next to the line labeled Construction Crew, and moved on to the next one. The next line was labeled Medicine, and next to it was the word Urgent, written 3 days ago in his own hand. 12 people in a confined space for 18 months without a doctor. That's not a bunker. That's a mass grave. There were 10 spots left, and among them there had to be one person who knew how to handle a scalpel and make decisions. Kim Ji-woo had been working in the emergency medicine department at Incheon City Hospital for 9 consecutive years. Park found her name not through personal connections, but through the hospital's website, where the doctors on duty for each shift were listed. He needed someone with experience working under resource-constrained conditions, and emergency medicine was a perfect fit. He arrived at the hospital at 2:20 p.m., got in line at the reception desk, and waited 40 minutes without getting irritated. When his turn came, he said he wanted to speak with Kim Ji-woo about a personal matter unrelated to medicine. The receptionist looked at him suspiciously, and Park placed a 50,000 won bill on the counter. He said it was for 15 minutes of her work time, and that the conversation wouldn't violate any protocols. The receptionist took the bill, and 7 minutes later, a woman in a white lab coat over a blue uniform emerged from a side door. Kim Ji-woo was short and tired, and she looked at Park the way one looks at the next patient during a long shift. He introduced himself and said he had a proposal and needed exactly 10 minutes to present it. She said she had 8 and led him to an empty treatment room at the end of the hallway. Park spoke without preamble or mincing words and laid out a single page from Emma's folder with the forecast. Minus 58 degrees. March 2027. 9 days until complete infrastructure collapse, calculated using satellite data. Kim Ji-woo read the page, her expression unchanged, because emergency medicine doctors know how to keep a straight face. She looked up and asked what exactly he wanted from her. Her voice was steady, showing neither fear nor interest. Yet. Park said, "A spot in a 12-person bunker in exchange for medical support for the group for the entire duration of the quarantine." He added that the bunker was being built in Incheon, that construction had already begun, and that it would be ready in 20 weeks. Kim Ji-woo placed the page on the table, stared at it, and remained silent, while Park counted the seconds and reached 21. She asked what the group's composition was and whether there were any people with chronic illnesses among them that he knew of. Park said that the group was being formed and that she would receive medical data on each participant before the start of quarantine. She asked what medical supplies were covered by the budget, and Park gave her a figure, 800,000 won. Kim Ji-woo looked at him as if he didn't understand the basics, and it was a fair assessment. She said that 800,000 won was enough for 3 weeks for 12 people, assuming no complications. She said that the minimum medical budget for 18 months of quarantine was 5 million won. Park looked at her and didn't argue, because she was right, and arguing with the truth is a waste of time. He said the budget would be adjusted and that the medical line item would be given second-level priority after concrete. Kim Ji-woo picked up the page again and read it a second time, this time more slowly, which indicated a different level of attention. She asked about the source of the data, and Park gave her the same answer he had given Lee Sang-hoon. The math is open and verifiable. She nodded and said she wanted to see the site before making a decision, and Park said that would be possible tomorrow morning. They agreed on 8 in the morning, and Kim Ji-woo tucked the page into the pocket of her lab coat. And that was the first physical sign. A person who puts a document in their pocket has already begun to think of it as their own, rather than someone else's. Park left the hospital, stopped on the street, and took stock of what had changed over the past 72 hours. 20 million in funding. A 5-person team at the site. A meteorologist is coming from Busan in 4 days. The doctor is coming to inspect it tomorrow, which means she'll most likely agree, because smart people come to inspect things. The budget deficit was still 23 million, and the medical cost added another 5, bringing the total to 28. Park walked back to the warehouse, thinking about the 2 candidates Lee Sang-hoon had mentioned but hadn't yet named. He took out his phone and sent Lee Sang-hoon a message. "I need the names and profiles by 8 p.m. today." The reply came 4 minutes later, containing 2 names and 2 lines for each, without any extra words. First, Woo Chang-sok, civil engineer, specializes in underground utilities, former municipal employee. Second, Na Un-bi, agronomist, specializes in hydroponics and closed-loop cultivation systems, works in the private sector. Park stopped in the middle of the street, reread the second name and specialty, and smiled quietly because it was spot on. 12 people in a bunker for 18 months without a food source? That's a supply that will run out before the end of the term. An agronomist specializing in hydroponics isn't just a spot in the bunker. It's the difference between survival and a slow death. He put his phone away and kept walking, and the list in his head grew shorter and more specific with every block he passed. 7 spots remained, and each one had to fill a gap that, left unfilled, would kill everyone else from the inside. Jong Byung-gi's crew showed up at dawn, and the 5 men stood by the warehouse as a single, silent unit. Park opened the door and looked at them, and each of the 5 looked back at him without questions and without words. Jong introduced them one by one, and Park memorized every face and every name on the first try, without needing to repeat them. Ko Sang-woo, Park Chol, Oh Jae-ho, Han Gil, Yoon Tae-sik. 5 men, each with calluses on their hands from real work. Park didn't give speeches or explain the big picture because that wasn't their concern at this stage. He said the site was 400 meters to the north, and that today they were there to survey and assess the ground. Jung Byung-gi nodded, and the crew followed Park without a word, which was the right way to start. The site was empty and surrounded by an old corrugated iron fence, and Park unlocked the gate with his key and opened it. The area measured 920 square meters, and beneath last winter's snow, there was no one here. Im Hak-jun arrived 20 minutes later with a tube of blueprints and laid them out right on the ground by the gate. The crew looked at the blueprints, and Park looked at the crew, seeing how a professional eye assessed the scale. Ko Sang-woo crouched down, took a handful of soil, rubbed it between his fingers, and sniffed it, a gesture of someone who knows. He said the top layer was soft, that there was a sense of density beneath it, and that they could start digging on Monday. Park said they would start digging today, and that Monday was a word that didn't exist on this site. Jung Byung-gi looked at him, and there was no objection in his gaze, only a clarification of the pace, and Park accepted that look. At 8 a.m., Kim Ji-woo appeared in civilian clothes with a small bag, stopped at the gate, and surveyed the site. Park approached her, led her inside, and showed her a cross-section drawing of the bunker without further comment. She studied the drawing for 4 minutes and asked questions, and her questions were as precise as those of someone who was already inside. She asked where the medical bay would be, and Park pointed to Section B on the drawing, which was 18 square meters in size. She said that 18 meters would be sufficient if the layout was correct and asked for a pencil. Park handed her a pencil, and she made 3 corrections to the medical bay's layout directly on the drawing without hesitation. Im Hak-jun looked at the changes and nodded. That was his way of saying the changes were technically correct. Kim Ji-woo returned the pencil and said she agreed, adding that she needed a list of participants by the end of the week for the medical records. Park nodded, and she left. Exactly 22 minutes had passed between her arrival and departure, and everything was settled. By 10 in the morning, the crew was already at work, and the first blows of the shovels against the ground sounded like the beginning of something irreversible. Park stood at the edge of the future excavation pit and looked down. The ground beneath his feet was hard, cold, and real. Lee Sang-hoon showed up at noon in work clothes he had clearly bought that morning, which fit awkwardly. Park looked at him and didn't comment on the clothes because the man had come to work, and that was more important than his clothes. He assigned Lee Sang-hoon to mark the perimeter under Ko Sang-woo's supervision, and the financial analyst took the tape measure. Ko Sang-woo explained something to him in a low voice, and Lee Sang-hoon listened and followed instructions, which was also a good start. At 2:30 p.m., Park left the site and headed to the address he had found for Woo Chang-sok through the engineering license registry. Woo Chang-sok worked at a small design firm 3 blocks from the port and saw Park without an appointment. He was a large man of few words, and when Park got to the point in 8 minutes, the engineer didn't interrupt him once. Woo Chang-sok asked only one thing. What diameter of ventilation ducts was specified in the current design? Park quoted the figure from Im's blueprint, and the engineer shook his head and said that wasn't enough for 12 people. He said that with that volume of chambers and that group composition, a diameter 40% larger than the minimum was needed. Park looked at him and thought that this was already the third specialist to find a critical flaw in Im's design. Im Hak-jun was a theorist, and his blueprints were a skeleton, not a body, and the body was being built here and now by living people. Park told Woo Chang-sok that a spot in the bunker was waiting for someone who would get the ventilation right, not just good enough. The engineer looked at him for 7 seconds, then stood up, put on his jacket, and said he wanted to see the site today. They walked back in silence, and it was the right kind of silence between two people who had no time for unnecessary words. At the site, the crew had already dug down 1.5 meters, and dirt was flying out of the excavation rhythmically and without stopping. Chang-sok watched the work and looked at the blueprints, and 10 minutes later, he pointed out 2 more problems in the project to Pak. Pak took notes and didn't defend Ima's blueprints, because blueprints are a tool, not a sacred object, and tools can be changed. As the sun began to set, the site became a different place, alive and bustling, smelling of earth, sweat, and work. Park stood at the gate and watched what had begun. Inside, there was no joy, only the cold precision of a completed calculation. 6 spots remained. The meteorologist is on his way. The agronomist is waiting for the meeting. And somewhere in the city was another person he didn't know yet. Yoon-bi lived outside the city, 30 kilometers from Incheon, in a place not marked on the phone's maps. Park got there by bus in 40 minutes and walked the last 2 kilometers along a dirt road. The road led to a low, long building made of polycarbonate and metal, and inside, white artificial light was glowing. A greenhouse. Large and imposing, and in no way resembling an amateur garden in any of its exterior details. Park pushed open the door, and inside was humid, warm air and the smell of earth and greenery and something chemically pure. Racks stretched 20 meters into the depths, and on every level, something was growing in a nutrient solution without soil. Eun-bi stood with her back to him by the far rack, measuring something with a device, and didn't turn around when he entered. Without turning around, she said that private visits were by appointment only, and that the schedule was booked solid for the next 3 weeks. Park walked deeper into the greenhouse and stopped 2 meters away from her, watching the racks while she worked. The setup was impressive. A closed-loop water system, automatic nutrient solution delivery, and spectral lamps above each tier. He named the brand of the pump system he saw on the side panel and added that its capacity was underestimated. Eun-bi turned and looked at him, and in her gaze there was not interest but assessment, and that was the right start. She was about 30 years old and held a tablet with tables and a device for measuring the solution's acidity. Park said that the system's capacity could be increased by 22% by reconfiguring the cycle timers. She looked at him for another 3 seconds, and then asked how he knew the specifications of this particular pump model. Park said he had read the documentation the night before because he was going to speak with someone who knew everything about it. Eun-bi lowered the tablet and looked at him, and in her gaze the assessment gave way to something resembling attention. Park got to the point in 7 minutes, and spoke not of the first disaster, but of a food supply system for 12 people. He spoke of the area and the light cycle and the selection of crops that yield the maximum calories per square meter. He spoke of how a bunker with a volume of 840 cubic meters has vertical space available for shelving. Only then did he place a single page in front of her with the temperature forecast for March 2027. Eun-bi took the page and read it, her face calm because she had clearly thought about this before. She said that the past 2 winters had shown anomalies that worried her and that she had made calculations for this scenario. She said she had seeds of adapted crops and cultivation protocols for closed systems without natural light. Park smiled quietly because she had arrived at this conversation before him, just from the other end and by a different path. She asked how much space was allocated for the agricultural section, and Park quoted the figure from the blueprint, 60 square meters. Eun-bi shook her head and said that 60 meters with 3-tiered racks would yield 180 usable meters. She said that was enough for the group's basic nutrition, but not enough for a complete protein balance. Park asked what was needed for a complete balance, and she listed an additional 20 meters, and a legume cultivation system. He took notes and didn't argue because she was speaking from knowledge, and he knew she was right without needing to verify it. Eunbi asked who else was in the group, and Park listed the members by role, not by name. Builders, a doctor, an engineer, and an analyst. She nodded, and something appeared in her gaze that hadn't been there at the start of the conversation. A sense of involvement in something specific. Park said that the spot in the bunker was hers, that the agricultural section was being built to her specifications, and that it was non-negotiable. She looked at him and asked a single question that wasn't about the bunker, but about him personally as a person. She asked why he was doing this, and there was neither suspicion nor warmth in her voice, only a pure question. Park looked at her and thought for exactly 2 seconds before saying that he had no other option, and that was his final answer. Eunbi nodded, put the page back in her pocket, and said she would come to the site on Friday and wanted to see the blueprints. Park said the blueprints would be updated by Friday to reflect her requirements regarding floor space and the shelving system. She returned to the shelving unit and picked up the device again, which meant the conversation was over and the decision had been made. Park stepped out of the greenhouse. Outside, the air was cold, the road was unpaved, and it was 30 kilometers back to Incheon. He walked toward the bus stop, counting. 9 people, including himself, 5 seats left, and time was running out. Meteorologist Jung-min Jae would arrive tomorrow, making him the 10th, and after him there would be 2 spots left, and both had to be accurate. Jung-min Jae walked from the bus station and found the warehouse without help or a phone call, and that was a good sign. He was 7 years younger than his brother and looked like a man who hadn't slept in a long time but kept thinking non-stop. Jung Byung-gi met him at the door, and they hugged briefly and without words, and then his brother stepped back and introduced him to Park. Jung-min Jae, meteorologist, 7 years with the National Atmospheric Monitoring Service, and the last 2 years in Busan. Park looked at him and saw a man whose mind already contained what he himself had seen while dying in the basement of the shopping center. They sat down at the desk, and Park placed the temperature forecast and satellite data from EMA's folders in front of him. Jung-min Jae looked at the data and remained silent. And the silence lasted a long time. But Park didn't rush him or fill the silence. 11 minutes later, the meteorologist looked up and said one word. And that word was, where? Park said that the source was classified, that the math was verifiable, and that he was waiting for the expert's assessment, not questions about the source. Jung-min Jae looked at him for another 3 seconds, then lowered his gaze back to the data and began to speak quietly and evenly. He said that the polar vortex had been exhibiting an unusual stabilization of its shift for 8 consecutive months. He said that within the monitoring service, this fact had been recorded, but the interpretation was officially recognized as ambiguous. He said that 3 months ago, he had written an internal report forecasting a critical shift, and the report had been classified. Park smiled quietly, because a closed report is not a refutation. It is a confirmation that people are afraid to voice aloud. Jung-min Jae said that his data indicated a probability of a catastrophic event ranging from 71 to 79%. Park looked at him, and inside him there was not joy, but the cold precision of a man who had long known this answer by heart. 71%. Lee Sang-hoon had arrived at 34% in a single night using publicly available data without access to the archives. The meteorologist with the classified report and 7 years of monitoring give a figure twice as high, and that was the real number. Jung-min Jae asked when construction would begin, and Park said it had started 3 days ago and the excavation was already 2 meters deep. The meteorologist stood up, put on his jacket, and said he wanted to see the site, and Park stood up after him without a word. They walked to the site in silence, and Jung Byung-gi walked beside his brother. Between the brothers was a silence deeper than words. At the site, the crew was working, and the excavation was already 2 meters and 20 centimeters deep, with walls that were smooth and solid. Jung-min Jae stood at the edge, looking down, and his face bore the expression of a man making an irreversible decision. He asked Park how much time was left until the event, and Park said, 171 days, according to his calculations. The meteorologist nodded and said that according to his calculations, the window was between 160 and 185 days. Park looked at him and said calmly, his spot in the bunker and his data were needed by the group every week until the start of isolation. Jung Min-jae said that he had access to a closed monitoring system in Busan and that he could transmit the data.
Park said that this access must be preserved until the very last day, and that after that day, it would no longer be needed. The meteorologist looked at him, and there was something dark in his gaze, and Park knew that it was not fear, but understanding. A person who knows the exact date of the end sees the world differently than everyone else around him, and it is a loneliness of a special kind. Park knew this better than anyone else at this facility because he had seen that end not in data, but with his own eyes in the darkness. They returned to the warehouse, and Jung Min-jae sat down at the table, opened his laptop, and began downloading the data without being asked. Im Hak-jun looked at the screen over the meteorologist's shoulder, and his face was that of a man who had been working blindly for 8 months. Now he had the national monitoring data, the classified report, and the figure of 71%, instead of calculations based on archives.
Park walked over to the window and looked out at the street, taking stock of what had changed in the 10 days since he'd woken up in the basement. 10 people. A pit 2 meters 20 deep. 20 million won in the account. The crew was working 7 days a week. There was still a shortfall of 28 million, and 5 spots remained. Among those 5, there was one that troubled him. Not because he didn't know who to put there, but because he did know, and that person was the last one he wanted to see by his side. Kang Joo-hyun knew how to build, how to negotiate, and how to keep quiet, and he had connections that Park needed right now. Park stood by the window, staring at a single point. Inside him was not rage but calculation, and that calculation was cold and precise as always. He hadn't made a decision yet, but he already knew that a decision would have to be made and that he had absolutely no time to hesitate.
Park hadn't slept all night, thinking of Kang Joo-hyun not as an enemy but as a resource, and it was the coldest decision of his life. Joo-hyun knew how to deal with people who couldn't be found through registries, licenses, or official databases. He knew suppliers of construction materials who sold without paperwork, without questions, and without unnecessary witnesses. He knew people in City Hall who turned a blind eye to unregistered excavation work for a reasonable sum. Without these connections, the bunker was vulnerable on 3 fronts: supplies, permits, and people who knew how to keep quiet for money. Park knew all this, and knew that an alternative to Joo-hyun would require 3 weeks of searching, which he didn't have to spare. At 6 a.m., he got up from the floor, washed his face, ate a bar from his backpack, drank some water, and sat down at the table with a blank sheet of paper. He wrote a list of what Joo-hyun would bring to the project, and a list of what Joo-hyun posed as a threat within the group. The left column was longer than the right, and that was the only argument that mattered under the circumstances. Park folded the sheet, put it in his pocket, left the warehouse on that gray morning, and walked in the direction he knew by heart. Joo-hyun lived 2 districts away from here, in a 5th-floor apartment overlooking the container terminal and the gray sea. Park knew this address because he had been there dozens of times, and because some knowledge doesn't fade away along with trust. He stopped at the entrance and looked up at the 5th-floor windows. A light was on in one of them, which meant Joo-hyun was home. Park entered the building, went up to the 5th floor, stopped in front of the door, and stood there for exactly as long as necessary. He rang the bell once and waited. There were footsteps behind the door, then silence, and then a voice asked who was there. Park stated his name flatly and without inflection, and it became very quiet behind the door. The silence lasted 8 seconds. The door opened, and Kang Joo-hyun stood in the doorway, looking at Park. His face was completely colorless. He was in his pajamas and unshaven, and his eyes were those of a man who hadn't slept well for several days in a row. Park looked at him, and inside there was nothing but calculation, a calculation as pure and cold as concrete in a foundation pit. Joo-hyun opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and said he didn't understand how this was possible, his voice breaking midway through. Park said he would come in, that he had a business proposal, and that there would be no personal conversation at all. Joo-hyun stepped back, and Park entered, closed the door behind him, and surveyed the apartment methodically from left to right. Everything was in its place: the sofa, the table, the kitchen, the view of the terminal, and the smell of a home where a person spends too much time alone. Park sat down at the table without being invited and placed a single sheet of paper in front of Joo-hyun with the temperature forecast for March 2027. Joo-hyun looked at the sheet, then at Park, then back at the sheet. His hands on the table were the hands of a man with no ground beneath his feet. Park gave him 3 minutes and then began to speak, speaking evenly, without pauses, and without a single personal inflection in his voice. The project, the site, the team's functional breakdown, deadlines. What exactly was required of Joo-hyun, to what extent, and by when? Joo-hyun listened, and his face shifted from white to gray, and from gray to something more complex and difficult to read. When Park finished, Joo-hyun asked why he had come specifically to him, and there was no arrogance in the question, only genuine confusion. Park said he had come because Joo-hyun had the necessary connections, and because the selection of people was determined by function, not history. Joo-hyun looked at him for a long time, and there was something in his gaze that Park didn't even name to himself, because it didn't matter. Park said the terms were as follows: connections, supplies, and municipal contacts in exchange for a single spot in the bunker. He added that Joo-hyun would work at the facility on equal footing with everyone else, and that there would never be any private conversations between them. He stated the last condition separately, and his voice had the tone of a verdict, leaving no room for appeal. Joo-hyun nodded, and it was the quietest response Park had ever heard from him in the 7 years they'd known each other. Park stood up and said that Joo-hyun was to report to the facility tomorrow at 7 in the morning, and that being late meant the door would be closed forever. He walked out, closed the door, and went down to the street, where the air was cold, the sea was gray in the distance, and the smell of salt hung in the air. Park walked back to the warehouse, and inside him there was neither anger nor satisfaction, only the next task waiting to be solved. 4 items remained: money, a municipal contact he didn't yet have, a shortfall of 28 million. Joo-hyun would bring suppliers and contacts, but he wouldn't bring money, and the money had to be found separately, and found quickly. 28 million won wasn't an abstract figure, but a concrete list of materials that were missing: reinforcement for the pile foundation, larger diameter ventilation ducts as requested by Woo Chang-suk, a generator, medical equipment according to the list Kim Ji-woo had sent at 7 in the morning, which took up 2 pages in small print, a shelving system for the agricultural section, per Na-eun-B's specifications, expanded to 80 square meters. Park sat at the table, looking at the consolidated estimate and calculating without a calculator, and the numbers added up to one unpleasant total. The 20 million from Lee Sang-hoon covered the concrete, piles, and basic finishing, and nothing else. Im's 4 million went toward the first batch of rebar and the rental of construction equipment to start the excavation. He had 200,000 won left in cash, and a blank line in the estimate opposite every critical item. Joo-hyun arrived at the site at 6:58 a.m., stood by the gate, and waited, and Park opened the gate at exactly 7 o'clock, without a second's delay. Jung Byung-gi's crew looked at the new guy, and Park didn't explain who he was, and no one asked because work is more important than personal backgrounds. Joo-hyun inspected the excavation pit and the blueprints, and 20 minutes later named 2 rebar suppliers who operate without proper documentation. The first offered a price 18% below market value. The second offered a 45-day payment deferral. Park chose the second one without hesitation, because a payment deferral is a loan with no interest, no bank, and no questions asked. Joo-hyun made a call right there and sealed the deal. The first shipment of rebar would arrive in 3 days, which covered one line item in the budget. Park watched Joo-hyun at work and saw what he had always known. This man was the best negotiator of all. This knowledge didn't negate his other knowledge, and Park kept both facts in his head simultaneously without any contradiction between them. In the afternoon, Park called Lee Sang-hoon and asked about the 2 candidates he had mentioned back at their first meeting. Lee Sang-hoon said that one of them was available to meet today, and that this man had money and a reason to listen. His name was So Jung-ho. He was the owner of a small logistics company and was 42 years old. Park jotted down the address and time, and at 3 p.m., he was at the entrance to the logistics company's office in Incheon's business district. So Jung-ho received him immediately. His office was small and tidy, with nothing superfluous on the desk. He was stocky and attentive, looking at Park the way people do who are used to assessing a partner within the first 30 seconds. Park presented his proposal in 9 minutes, and this time added one detail he hadn't shared with anyone before. He said that So Jung-ho's company's logistics infrastructure could become part of the facility's supply system by March. He said they needed 2 trucks and access to the company's warehouse facilities to store food supplies. So Jung-ho listened without moving, and only his fingers tapping on the table betrayed that his mind was working quickly and in several directions. He asked what the investment amount was, and Park named it. 15 million won and 1 spot in the bunker. So Jung-ho asked about a second spot, and Park said there was no second spot and that this condition was non-negotiable and unchangeable. The logistics manager looked at him, and Park could see that the man was thinking about his family. It was a moment that called for the right words. Park said that the decision on the group's composition was based on function, and that every person inside had to fill a critical position. He added that if there was someone among So Jung-ho's relatives with the required function, they could continue this conversation separately. So Jung-ho asked what required function meant, and Park listed 4 open positions without names or details. An electrician with knowledge of autonomous systems, someone with military or police training, a chemist or pharmacist, a mechanic. So Jung-ho listened, and when Park mentioned the last position, something changed in his expression, and Park noticed it immediately. He asked about the mechanic separately, and Park said they needed someone who knew how to maintain a generator and closed systems. So Jung-ho said that his younger brother, So Min-jun, had been working as a mechanic at a ship repair yard for 12 years. Park looked at him and smiled quietly to himself, because the logistics manager had just checked off 2 items on his list at once: money and a mechanic. 15 million won and a specialist in autonomous systems in a single 20-minute conversation. Park said he wanted to meet with the brother before making a final decision, and that the meeting needed to take place tomorrow morning. So Jung-ho nodded, took out his phone, and called his brother in front of Park. The conversation was brief, and the brother agreed to the meeting. Park stood up, shook So Jung-ho's hand, and left the office. Out on the street, he stopped and ran the numbers through his head. 15 million would cover the shortfall down to 13, and the mechanic brother would fill one of the 4 open positions. That left 3 open positions and 2 vacancies, a deficit of 13 million and 169 days. Park walked back toward the warehouse. The list in his head was shorter and more specific, and that was the only direction he was moving in. He waited with Min-jun at the gate of the shipyard at 7:30 a.m., and this was a man you could spot immediately in any crowd, not because of his height or his clothes, but because of the way he stood, steady and without unnecessary movement, like a well-secured part. Park approached and they shook hands. The handshake was brief, and Min-jun had the hands of a man who works with metal. They didn't go to a cafe or to an office, but stopped right at the gate because that was exactly what Min-jun had suggested. Park got to the point in 8 minutes, and this time he started with the mechanical aspects because this man spoke the language of machines. A generator capable of 800 hours of continuous operation, a closed ventilation system, and the pumps for the Na-eun-bi agricultural section, a backup power supply system in case the main generator failed, and its integration with the agricultural section's lighting system. Min-hun listened and asked questions, and the questions were as specific as a blueprint. The generator's make and the fuel reserve capacity. Park answered what he knew and spoke frankly when he didn't, and that was the right approach because mechanics don't like approximations. Min-hun asked how much fuel was allocated for 18 months of autonomous generator operation. Park quoted a figure from Im's estimate, and Min-hun shook his head and gave a different figure that was a third higher. He explained that Im had calculated the load under optimal conditions, but the actual load with the full team was 30% higher. Park took note and didn't argue, because this was already the fourth specialist to find an error in Im's calculations. Im Hak-jung had designed the project on his own, and a lone designer always calculates based on an optimistic scenario because he can't see any other. The team of specialists calculated based on a realistic scenario, and the difference between them cost money that wasn't available yet. Min-hun asked about a backup generator, and Park said there was no provision for one in the budget, and that was the honest, unpleasant truth. The mechanic looked at him, and there was no judgment in his gaze, only the assessment of a man who saw an unmitigated risk. He said that a single generator for 18 months under constant load was a critical level risk. He said that the average service life of a generator of this class under continuous operation ranges from 600 to 900 hours. 800 hours is 33 days, and 18 months is 540 days. The gap was obvious without words. Park looked at him and calculated. We need at least 2 generators with the ability to perform maintenance and replace components. Min-hun said that there was a decommissioned generator at the shipyard that could be restored for a reasonable price. He quoted the cost of restoration, 280,000 won and 3 weeks of work, and he would do it himself during his off hours. Park looked at him and smiled quietly, because the mechanic had just solved a problem that Park hadn't yet managed to voice aloud. He asked Min-jun directly, what did he want in exchange for a spot in the bunker, aside from maintaining the systems? Min-jun answered without a pause and without drama. He wanted his mother to join the group in his place. Park looked at him, showing nothing on the outside, while inside his mind worked through the calculation quickly and without sentimentality. The mechanic's mother didn't fill any of the open functional positions, and that was a fact that wouldn't change just because of a wish. Park asked how old his mother was and what she did, and Min-jun said, 61 years old and a pharmacist at a pharmacy her whole life. Park paused at that word, and something clicked inside him like a lock opening with the right key. A pharmacist with 60 years of experience working with medications. That wasn't just a position. It was a closed pharmacist position. Kim Ji-woo had listed a pharmacist on her priority list, and Park remembered this because he remembered everything he had read. He told Min-jun that his mother would get the position, and that Min-jun himself would get the position, and that both conditions were met. Min-jun looked at him, and there was something in his gaze that Park chose not to analyze because time was more valuable than analyzing emotions. Park said that his mother needed to be brought to Incheon within 10 days, and that Kim Ji-woo would conduct a medical interview with her. Min-jun nodded and reached for his phone, but Park stopped him with a gesture and said they needed to check out the site first. They drove to the site. The excavation pit was already 3 meters deep, and the crew was working down below like a well-oiled machine. Min-jun stood at the edge and looked down, then examined the blueprints and asked Woo Chang-sok 3 technical questions in a row. Woo Chang-sok answered, and a conversation arose between the 2 engineers that Park didn't interrupt because that conversation was worth money. They found another problem in the wiring diagram and began to solve it right there at the blueprints without being asked and without pausing. Park stepped aside and updated the list in his head. 12 people, all 12 spots filled, and the list was complete. Im Hak-jun, Lee Sang-hun, Jong Byung-gi, Jong Min-jae, Kim Ji-woo, Na Eun-bi, Woo Chang-sok, Ju Hyun. So Jong-ho, so Min-jun, Min-jun's mother, and himself. 12. The number was set, and this was the first moment in 13 days when a single task had been completely resolved. The shortfall remained at 13 million, and that was the next task, already waiting for him just around the corner. Guys, if you've made it this far, drop a comment. What do you think will happen next? Or you can find out right now on my Patreon. The next part is already available.